for we too are God's offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by art and imagination of mortals. This is the word of the Lord. Well, we're together again, as we are able to be after another week in semi-quarantine. We are living in stressful times. We are living in historically uncertain times. And now we're headed into an election cycle that will continue to be historically divisive. We need help. I find sometimes it helps to be reminded that we're not the first generation to be tackling these kinds of issues. We can learn from history if we're willing. And the scriptures that we read each week are history. Centuries of people struggling with their own human nature and economic systems, struggling with family relationships and social expectations. This is a history of people seeking to find God and of God seeking to draw people together in mutually supportive relationship. So today we read a few words from Jesus to his followers, the end of his life, when he said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." A big request, but really the main commandment that he mentioned over and over and over is to love one another, to love God and your neighbor as yourself. He did make a point to make sure that you knew that your neighbor includes your enemy. So how to fulfill that commandment is something that people have contemplated and discussed and tried to do for centuries. There are many ways that we can try to live out this ideal of loving others, even in divisive times. But before we can really, truly love someone, we have to know them and understand them. So the first step in loving is listening. Listening itself is a form of loving. And I know the introverts out there really enjoy hearing that, because some of us find listening way easier than talking. But real caring, attentive, active listening, it's difficult for everyone. It takes energy to pay attention, especially when we're trying to be intentional about restraining our own judgments, holding back our opinions until we've earned the right to speak. Now, our story that we read from the book of Acts is a good historical example of active, non-judgmental, open-minded listening. Listening to learn, listening to understand other people before you assume you have anything to say or the right to be heard. Now, previous to this event that we have stepped into, Paul has been spending time with his people, with people just like him, people with the same background. Since he was Jewish, he would go to the synagogue, where most of the people spoke the same language and already knew the Hebrew scriptures. So talking about Jesus as a Messiah, well, it was at least an idea they understood. They didn't always agree, but each person understood where the other was coming from. But now he's visiting Athens, at the heart of the Greek culture. So he begins by wandering the streets, doing a little sightseeing, taking a personal tour of the religious spaces. And then while he's talking with his Jewish friends, some Stoic philosophers come by and they invite him to come to their place to talk. The Areopagus in Paul's day, well, it was the place where the local leaders gathered to discuss social issues, legal matters, philosophy, politics. He had a chance to meet with some of the top people in the social and political thinking of Athens. But here, he could no longer assume that they had the same background information to talk about. Words like Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, a Messiah, these were not really relevant terms in this context. Here, he would have to know their language, their values, their assumptions about what gives life meaning, where God fits in. So, having a deep understanding of this truth, he starts a conversation with honest compliments. Something they do have in common. He says, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. I've walked through the city. I've looked carefully at the objects of your worship. He's not baiting them with false flattery. He's really admiring their pursuit of divine knowledge, their quest for deeper understanding of truth. There are no words of judgment, no expressions of superiority or disgust. Rather, by recognizing the value of their spiritual practices, respecting their culture, understanding their context, Paul was finding a way to open a genuine conversation about what each person believed and what they knew to be true. Notice how he affirms their common humanity and God's love for everyone. When he says, I notice among your many places of interest an altar with the inscription to an unknown God. I think that what you worship as unknown might be what I'm talking about here. For I understand that the God who made the world and everything in it is Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in shrines made by human hands. The God who gives all humans life and breath and all good things. Paul affirms their history, affirms their artists. He says, in God we live and move and have our being, even as some of your own poets have said, we too are the offspring of God. It doesn't matter where you're born, what your tribe or your nation, God is close to and calling each of us. And he urges the Athenians to listen to their own poets who experienced and described the nearness of this maybe unnamed God. After listening to and learning from the people that he's met, Paul affirms that he believes that God has made the whole world and everything, and every single person is a child of God. There is no person, there is no fear of influence that is outside of God's care and concern. All of what we may try to call secular life are places of God's presence. Whether it's the law, literature, medicine, education, arts, business, government, science, absolutely everything, anything is a part of God's loving presence. So in a way, Paul viewed the Greek meeting place as one more place where the Lord of all creation has gone before him, was already present. And he was looking for the Spirit of God at work wherever people are sharing ideas and seeking peaceful resolution to conflict. This is essential to our understanding of God now in this 21st century as well. Even now, God does not live in shrines made by human hands. God does not live only in churches built by people who claim to be Christian. God is at work out in the world everywhere, reconciling relationships, bringing about peace, offering grace and forgiveness and new beginnings again and again. The God in whom we live and move and have our being is everywhere, already at work, already drawing the hearts of people towards hope and faith and love. So it might be that as followers of Jesus, what we need to do more than anything is walk alongside those who are seeking truth. Listen to their stories and their needs and their hopes. And as we try to listen and love better, Joellen Demetrius has some suggestions for active listening in her book, Reading People. because listening as a way of loving takes effort. The first rule of good listening is don't interrupt. It's impossible to listen well when you're already talking or you're planning what you're going to say next. And it's natural to be thinking of how we want to respond, or we often feel the need to give advice. But what people need most is to be heard, understood, valued. Second thing we can do is start with empathy. To be careful not to condemn, to argue, to patronize. Even something as simple as saying, well, you don't know that, everybody knows that, can shut down a conversation. Nothing faster than a judgmental comment to stop communication. Third, we want to be involved without being too intense. When someone is sharing what is truly important to them, they want to know they're being heard. We can do that simply by saying, yes, I understand, showing that we're involved in this story. And then we can be aware of body language, both ours and theirs. The reality is, if we're not really interested, people can tell. Our body language will give it away, the look on our face, looking away as if you're thinking about something else. Clues to whether we're truly, deeply, carefully listening. Whether you really care enough to learn what they have to teach you, what is important to them in their life moments. They will feel that and see that. So we need to listen for what we do have in common first. What passions ignite their hearts and resonates with ours as well. Only when we do this will we have earned the trust to share our story, our values, the things that we care about. And right now in our time, in all that is going on, we need to remember that listening might include writing Facebook and Instagram and Twitter posts that ask honest questions rather than making judgmental comments. Because the truth is, we can no longer assume that we have the same background information needed to understand the people where they're coming from. We could be living in the same country, the same state, the same city, and yet be hearing very different versions of what is happening in the world. We're watching separate channels of news. We're listening to different podcasts, different music. We may be speaking the same language and hearing and understanding things very differently. And until we listen to one another, we won't know why we have this separation and division. So we begin to love by listening. We can't know what another person needs without listening first. As Mary Oliver has written, "This is the first, the wildest, and the wisest thing I know, that the soul exists and is built entirely out of attentiveness." We need to pay attention. We may not be able right now to hug and shake hands, but we have plenty of opportunities to listen to one another. So maybe we can learn from history. We can learn from those who've gone before us through uncertain times, how to love, how to listen. By giving the gift of our attention and our honest questions, we can care for one another, even if it is on the phone or through a mask. Let us love one another as Christ has commanded.